I co-listed those companies on the Toronto Stock Exchange, and then listed one company on the London Stock Exchange. And I'm still deputy chairman of that company on the London Stock Exchange. And then about 2 years ago, I was invited by Community Foundation for Surrey to join their Funder Plus program. And if I can now say a little bit about CFS and the Funder Plus program. As I'm sure you're aware, CFS is one of 47 community foundations in the UK, and it's one of the fastest growing philanthropic movements here. And it provides an assured interface between donors and charities in need. In other words, there are donors who want to grant funds, but they want an interface to the charity to make sure that the charity is going to use those funds effectively and that the governance is in order. Now, in around about 2020, they said, well, it's all very good making grants, but charities need more than that. And so Community Foundation for Surrey set up a service arm. And this is aimed at providing support to charities on governance. In particular, and this is my area has become my area of expertise, is on charity accounting. So after a proof of concept, Funder Plus has been fully active over the last 24 months, helping around about 25 charities, 10 of whom have required accounting support. And all of them, I'm pleased to say, very grateful for that accounting support. And typically, we provide assistance to those charities that already have a relationship with CFS or whose relationship to CFS, whose application to CFS for grants has been rejected. So our topic today is a financial plan, and of course we'll make these slides available to you. And the thing is about a financial plan is that, as I'm sure you appreciate, is it requires sound foundations, which is why I've pictured things and our agenda today in the form of this pyramid or triangle, if you like. And as we go through the discussion over the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking about all of these topics in turn from the bottom up. So if I may, the first thing I'd like to do is remind you, and I'm sure all of you are pretty familiar with this, is that the relevant regulation for charities in the UK is called FRS 102, and it's called the Standards of Recommended Practice. And my goodness gracious, it's all of 200 pages long. And it's not easy bedtime reading. So I've taken the liberty of summarizing this for you. And again, I'm sure you're aware that we need, in terms of FRS 102, to separately account for restricted and unrestricted funds. And of particular note, there can be no transfer between our funds, but only from you funds to our funds. And unrestricted funds are typically applied to core costs and to top up any overspent restricted funding activities. So it makes sense in your applications for grants to include within that application the fact that you're going to need about 15% of the application to contribute towards core costs. And the advantage of doing this is that you can spend that 15%, you're allowed to spend that 15% on the associated core cost to do with the application, and that protects the youth funds. And it's really important to protect those youth funds, because if you run out of our funds, they have to be topped up by the youth funds. Now, one observation I would make, and I do hope this is what you're doing already, is not to view accounting as a chore. but as an essential, regular management activity to gain a deeper understanding of how your charity runs. And in that regard, the system that we encourage people to adopt and assist them with is effectively to produce at least monthly management accounts rather than just the annual statement of financial activities and the balance sheet. And in fact, the system that we've got enables you to make a report to the Charity Commission or to Companies House, if you're a CIC, the moment you add a new transaction. It's that real time. If you add a transaction, the Charity Commission report is updated and/or your Companies House report is updated. And that's the approach that we recommend. And then I'm sure some of you are using Xero or Sage or QuickBooks, but unless you've got a real guru in-house, those packages are really quite a challenge to use to manage, in particular, restricted accounts. And you're probably likely to need an Excel add-on. So that's a quick summary of FRS 102. Now, let's move on to risk analysis. And this looks a very busy slide, but I'm going to walk you through it nice and carefully. And you can see where we are because I've repeated the agenda up there in that box on the right-hand side. And with a risk analysis, and I do recommend this to all of you, it's an invaluable 2-hour exercise for trustees. And the recommended approach is in the industry, whether you're a public company, a private company, or a charity, is to look at your risks based on those that are strategic in nature, financial, operational, and governance. And just like being faced, if you're a doctor or you're in the ER department of a hospital, the best approach to adopt is to triage your risks. In other words, to try and establish which of those risks is the most serious. And the way that you do this is you look at its probability of occurring, its impact on the charity, and the direction of the risk versus the last time that you did the exercise. We score each of those out of 5. But because there's something of an overlap between direction and probability, we only take 50% of the score out of 5 for the direction. And then we multiply the scores and we get our triage of those risks. And what I've done, I've taken the liberty below in the colorful part of this slide of suggesting to you some types of risks that you might be facing. And the strategic ones should typically be owned by the trustees and probably the financial ones as well. And then the operational risks and the governance risks by the CEO or COO of the most senior parties in the charity. And here we've got some examples of the type of risk that you might be facing. Now, if your finances are struggling, and we'll come to that in a little bit, then you might be considering a merger with another charity. Now, the probability of that is probably only about 2, but its impact on your charity is going to be quite considerable. So let's score that at 5. So what we do is we simply multiply 2 times 5 gives us 10, and then half the direction score, which is 1.5, gives us a score of 15. So the relative risk potentially of that, if you're in the early stages of contemplating a risk, is relatively low. However, conversely, if you've had very successful growth and you're lottery funded, but the lottery funds are going to run out, then going forwards, you might have a lot of trouble funding that successful growth and resourcing that appropriately. In which case, because your lottery funds have run out, the probability of being short of money is 4. The impact is certainly very high, it's 5, and the direction is 5, in which case the overall score is 50. And so you can go through the other sorts of risks that you might be facing. I mean, if we go all the way down to governance, and we look at general data protection regulations and safekeeping. Now, if your charity is involved in working with children, or you've got records of the folk that you provide help to, then obviously those have got to be protected. And I'm sure you've got a mitigation plan in case you lose that information. But you imagine if one of your volunteers or one of your staff leaves that information on a train, then obviously that potentially is has a very serious impact on the charity. And well, if it's happened, it's certainly got a very high probability, in which case its score is very high. So I put this to you because it's a very useful exercise to do with your trustees. And in my view, it's an imperative exercise to do in realizing our objective today, and that is putting together a financial plan. Now, in doing your risk assessment, it might be that you've established that actually things are getting a bit dodgy for the charity. You are going to be short potentially of funds. Well, that may well come out of the risk exercise. And the immediate advice I have to give you here is to be very, very careful that you don't trade whilst you're insolvent. And unless you've got, as I described right at the beginning, unless you've got, in terms of FRS 102, a really good, up-to-date grasp of your restricted funds, how they've been spent, how much you've got left, and if by chance you've put all of your restricted funds into the same bank account, there's a real risk that you might not have a good enough grasp of your financial position, and then there might be a real risk of you trading whilst insolvent. And we'll touch on this again later on. Now, obviously, you'll want to think about whether the charity can be rescued, for example, by undertaking a merger, cutting costs, finding other ways of funding the charity. And in doing this, let's not forget that there's a moral responsibility here, because not only have you got your own people, your staff, and your volunteers to take into consideration, but you are providing a service to those you're assisting. And clearly, you've got to find, ideally, you've got to find a solution for them, and certainly you've got to be communicating with them. Do retain sufficient funds for a structured winding up, and do appreciate the human dimensions. Again, we'll come back to this regarding your staff, your volunteers, and your stakeholders. And I've spoken about the communication plan. Now, being a CEO or a treasurer when you're going through a change program, can be terribly lonely. And our recommendation to you is don't agonize and do seek advice in the first instance from Beverly. But if you already have an association with Community Foundation for Surrey, then we can provide support here. And then a few quick words about developing a rescue plan. Again, establish why the charity is at risk, follow the money. And as I've said here, from my experience, reducing costs is soul destroying. And so try and focus on the income. And in that regard, do you have a business plan? We'll come to that in a minute. Ask yourself, if you are failing, or if you have failed in raising funds, try and learn from that experience by going back and look at your bids history for those bids that have been successful and those that haven't been successful, and try and establish what the difference is between those two. Again, seek specialist advice here. Perhaps consider recasting the benefits that your charity is providing. And one piece of advice I've been giving charities is to take advantage of the focus in public companies and private companies of the environment, social impact, and governance. Now, what I mean by that is I'm sure that you're providing an excellent social service, but if by chance, and there are a few charities that we've dealt with that are making an important contribution to the environment, then talk to potential donors about that contribution to the environment, and also include in any application for funds how well your charity is governed. That's really, really important. And if you must focus on costs, then look at where value is added and try and protect that. Reduce your manpower as a last resort. Think about reapplying your assets in a different way. Look for synergies or a merger with another party. Try and stretch the time frame within which you can find a solution. And of course, approach your suppliers and see if you can get some discounts or a donation from them. Now, another very useful exercise that you can do with your trustees has got a grand title, but it's called a field force analysis. And I promise you that this, together with the risk analysis, will all make sense when we look at your financial plan and your business plan. And like the risk analysis, the first thing you do, and here on this chart, you follow the numbers, the first thing you do together with your trustees is stark reality of looking at your current position. How well are you doing? Are you doing really well? Are you really well funded? There's assurance of funds coming in, going forwards. That's a great position to be in. It probably means that you'll be able to grow. That's fantastic. And therefore, that will be the desired state going forwards. And you'll have drivers and you'll have imperatives associated with number two, the desired state of where you want to get to. And the combination of the desired state and the current position will provide you with a vision for your charity. But to complete the story, what you want to do is look at and stretch your imagination and look at extending the opportunities that your charity might be able to consider given its capabilities. And what you want to do is to maximize those. And conversely, and we've already covered part of the story, is you want to look at the constraints. Do you have enough space? Is your community center big enough to expand? And again, look at the risks, and you want to mitigate or minimize those. So in the same way, again, a busy slide, but the same way as we did with the risk analysis, I've put together here a simulation of this exercise. So for number one, here's a statement. We provide an essential service to our community. How do we sustain this? And then looking at the vision and the desired outcome, well, sustainability is absolutely crucial. And we need an assured funding strategy. Well, how are we going to achieve that? Perhaps we can extend our services in order to enhance our grant applications. That gives you a sense of what you want to do. And then you look at the opportunities. Well, there may be an opportunity to extend our community center. We might well be able to improve our communication plan to publicize our services, or we might even contemplate a merger. And there are ways in which we can maximize those opportunities by having a deeper understanding of our target market, improving the effectiveness of our social media, etc. And on the right-hand side, mitigation steps for the risks that we've already been talking about. And then we come to putting together the charity's business plan. And very often the response that we have received about putting together a business plan is that it takes a lot of effort and we never refer to it afterwards. And I think there's a mindset that a business plan is an enormous piece of work, when in fact, a really crisp business plan only needs to be 5 to 10 pages. But the reason, and if you look at this slide at the bottom, the reason I would argue for a business plan is that my view is that donors and community foundations will frankly soon be insisting on this. When you put forward your application, they may well come back to you and say, what's the latest status of your accounts? And can you share with us your business plan? And it's a fundamental document for a really good dialogue with the trustees, or if you're a CIC, with the board. And in particular, it's a statement of intent and how to realize those goals. And on this slide, in the box on the left, you'll see for the first time the thought that one of the assets that you've got is that your charity is a brand. Now, that may seem a little odd to you, but you've got a logo, you represent yourselves to an outside community. You might even have some business cards printed, but you've certainly got some promotional material available, and that's branded. And then you represent yourself to potential donors as an entity. And in my view, all of that is almost no different from the company that I'm deputy chairman of, which very definitely has a brand, and we need to protect that brand, and we need to nurture it and defend it. And so it's very useful to think about your charity in those regards. But here are some suggestions for you as to what, again, you would include in crisp statements, a few paragraphs, please, on all of those topics in a business plan. And here you'll see that I've included also a sustainability report. And this comes back to environment, social governance, ESG, and that is that you need to be thinking these days, as I'm sure you are because of the cost, you need to be thinking about your electricity consumption, your gas consumption, your utilities consumption, and the steps that you're taking to reduce those. And it's really, really useful to have a short report on those mitigation actions that you're taking, and potentially even including those in your grant applications. Why? Because it shows that you're a really well-managed charity, you're a classy charity, and you're worth considering providing funds to. And then we come to the source and application of funds. And this is, of course, the financial plan. And in the public company world, this is called the working capital statement. And it is essentially, where are the funds going to be coming from and how am I going to be applying those funds? It's not a complicated statement, relatively easy to put together, but you need the foundations of all of the things that we've been talking about previously. So the working capital statement, also known as the financial plan, would cover your current financial status, your budget for the forthcoming financial year, your assured sources of funds. If you're in the second year of a lottery grant, then you're pretty certain, and that's spread over 3 years, you're absolutely certain of getting the second tranche of those funds on a certain date. And And there'll be others that have given you grants in the past, and you're reasonably comfortable that you'll get those grants again. But you should also be drawing up a list of folk donors that you haven't approached to, but there's a reasonable probability, because they're in your area, of being able to raise the funds, but it's untested. And then again, stretch your imagination. I was talking to the lady CEO of a charity the other day, and it turns out her husband is absolutely fantastic at putting on golf days. And they've managed to raise really quite a lot of money from golf days. And that's made a tremendous contribution to the funds of the charity. And again, I've commented on this before: learn from your failures, review your funding history, and therefore, put together better grant applications. Now, 2 cautions. Again, I spoke earlier about trading whilst insolvent, and failure to monitor your restricted and your unrestricted funds accurately, and potentially holding your restricted funds in a separate bank account, could result in intermingling, and then with the U funds insufficient to cover any R fund shortfall. And that can put you in an extremely challenging financial position. And my words of advice here is, please, if your financial circumstances are being challenged, do not under any circumstances take on a liability, especially salaries, for which you do not have the funds. This can really put you in a difficult situation. If you've got all of your R funds in a single bank account, it might look as if you're okay, but those individual R funds are their own piggy bank, and they can't support each other. So this is where of course you've got to be careful. And the second caution, and this may have affected you, is that there's sometimes a disconnect between the staff responsible for applying for new funds and the treasurer, and each has their own model. And I've seen cases where this leads to a lot of frustration and duplication. And obviously you need to make sure that whoever's responsible for applying new funds and the treasurer are sharing the same model. Now, just a couple of slides to go. And that is the what I call the hierarchy of news. Now, what I mean by this is, let's assume that, well, let's hope that your charity is in good shape, in which case good news is wonderful. Let's assume you've won some important grants and the funds are assured. That's absolutely fantastic. But actually, bad news is second prize. And the reason I say that is because you can plan for the future of the charity, or indeed, if you've had some tests for a medical condition, a serious medical condition, then bad news actually, the second prize, if it comes quickly, means that you can plan for your treatment and hopefully address whatever is the problem that you've got. No news or delays is awful. And just recently, a charity I've worked closely with, the CEO, I obviously won't mention any names here, had to undergo a series of tests. And unfortunately, it took 6 months for the tests to come to a conclusion. Now, you can imagine the agony that individual went through. I'm pleased to say that at the end of the day, the tests were negative and the individual concerned was fine. But that period of no news was just awful. So if good news is great, but get to bad news quickly. Painful experience number 2 is the hierarchy of communicating, and that is face-to-face is an order of magnitude the best way. A telephone call, and this is if you've got to communicate bad news to somebody, a telephone call is just about okay, but email is the pits. And if somebody's done a really good piece of work, then a handwritten letter is really, really classy. And don't forget that, again, if you're going through a process of news, a process of change, if you leave a communication gap, it will be filled by information that you can't control. So if change is needed, don't delay telling those who may be affected. And obviously, town hall meetings are very effective in this regard, but sometimes difficult to manage. And it's a good idea to try and facilitate those. And again, don't forget the wider community of those that you've been helping, and they need to be communicated with as well. Now, of course, every plan, you will have often seen this quote, every plan breaks down on first contact with the enemy. But the problem is, if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a financial plan or a business plan, then it's difficult to adjust that for a change in circumstances. So to ensure success, do assign responsibility for delivery and make sure everybody knows who is responsible. Make that absolutely clear. Do allocate adequate resources, both human and financial. Put together an explicit plan of action, and for that, use a Gantt chart or something as simple. You don't need Microsoft Project, but a simple project plan. Have a regular follow-up with the individuals responsible to check on progress. If they're struggling or something doesn't work out, learn from that experience. And again, on the subject of bad news, second prize is fast failure. Don't hang on to hope. Find out quickly if you're not going to receive the funds. And then build relationships, obviously, again, in person, and take cognizance of the human toll, and that human toll is you as much as the other individuals. And then my last slide, and we're just coming up for about 30 minutes. My last slide is a footnote about fundraising, and I hope you might find this useful. And it's my sense that despite more and more philanthropy, and I'm sure you folk are seeing this, the competition for funds will be ever more intense because the need for charitable services grows ever greater. My second bullet here is a really important sentence. And fundraising is about crafting and then delivering a story that effectively matches a donor's intentions. So you've got to think about or get advice on what you think the donor would like to donate towards and craft your story accordingly. Introduce the services you provide to the community in the broadest possible terms of its impact. Now, again, I worked with a charity about 18 months ago, and they were fantastically good in their first few paragraphs of any funding application at explaining what they did, believe it or not, in an environment and social context, explaining what they did in the broadest possible context. And that was incredibly effective at raising funds. Do provide assurances in your grant application about how the funds will be managed. And in the same light, do describe your governance standards, and please, if these are deficient, act quickly, particularly your accounting standards and the effectiveness of the trustees and the board. Please don't miss your reporting deadlines. You've got plenty of time. You've usually got 10 months. The system that we recommend, as I said earlier, actually keeps your accounts up to date with the Charity Commission report every single time you add a new transaction. And that's the ideal position to get into. And then you're in a position to report back very effectively to donors on the use of funds. And above all else, think about your charity as a brand and protect that brand. Now, you've been incredibly patient, and we've covered a lot of ground, but I've been delighted to chat to you. I hope you found some of this or all of it useful, and I'm now very, very happy to take any questions from you.
Thank you very much, Laurie, for that very succinct and informative presentation. And of course, we're all very aware of a major organisation at the moment, the SNP, who are being investigated for spending restricted funds on core costs. And we don't know, of course, what else they're going to find out. But this is not uncommon, and I have experienced this myself with working with charities when looking at their accounts and asking questions. So I think there's a lot of key points that Laurie has raised in this presentation. So let's kick off the Q&A and discussion. Who's got a question or who'd like to ask a point that they might want clarification on, or open the discussion about some of the points that Laurie has raised?
Beverly, I have. So we have an area of funds that are in core costs. You know, things we've just raised during the year with nothing in particular in mind, which as trustees we try and then designate those funds, but I'm not quite too sure. But then equally, sometimes we might have to undesignate them. So I'm really not too sure where that sits.
Yes, it's a very good point, Gail. And let me, and I hope I'm going to answer this correctly. And I'm putting endowment funds to one side because that's a whole different category. But actually, there are three categories of typically three categories of funding. There are restricted funds, and then there are unrestricted designated funds, and then there are pure unrestricted funds. Now, unrestricted designated funds are typically those funds that are kept to one side by trustees for a specific activity. However, in the event that you start to run short with your usual unrestricted funds, for example, your core costs, they need to cover core costs or whatever, then the treasurer can approach the trustees and say, is it possible that we can take some funds from the unrestricted designated funds and apply those to our core costs? And I've actually been advising a charity to do that. But the better approach, and I do hope I'm answering your question correctly, the better approach is with your restricted fund applications, as I said in one of my slides. If you can make it clear in your application, and this is perfectly acceptable, this is generally completely understood by donors, that in your restricted fund application, you can ask them to acknowledge that about 15% of those funds are going to be needed to cover the core costs associated with running that restricted fund activity.
This is full cost recovery. It's sometimes referred to.
This is core cost recovery, if you like, and for those core costs, you actually allocate them into, I use this expression, piggy bank, into that activity's piggy bank, that restricted fund. That protects the unrestricted funds, and therefore, if one of the restricted funds overrun, then you've got unrestricted funds available to support the restricted funds. I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah. I mean, that's roughly how we are using it, but life's just not very certain at the moment, is it? So
Good.
No, and where I have seen unfortunate situations is, and Laurie touched upon this, is where an organisation has come to me for funding, but when I've looked at their accounts, they're running on empty, but they haven't realised they're running on empty because their funds have been restricted. They're looking at the end figure rather than designated funding allocation. And in some cases, that's been quite unfortunate. In other cases, we've managed to turn it around with a lot of effort. So other questions for Laurie?
Well, I'm just going to pick up on that point, and I, ladies, I'm sure you, some or all of you have got children, and I would take you back to the days of piggy banks. Maybe that's not common these days, but I remember in our case having a piggy bank for each of our 2 boys, and one way to look at restricted funds is that each child has a piggy bank, and that's restricted. Now, if one child wants to buy a toy that costs more than is in his piggy bank, then you can't take money from the other child's piggy bank. If you do, you're going to run into some trouble. And so, therefore, the only piggy bank that's available is the parents' piggy bank, and that's the unrestricted funds. So it's really important to keep those piggy banks separate.
And I don't know, organisations, certainly not in my experience, they're not all, when you look at the accounts, that sometimes it's they might just have an unrestricted block, but then you've got to delve much deeper into that to find where that block of money's come from, i.e. which funders, and what precise activities was that those funds designated to. So not just having the top level information, but breaking that down as well, I think is very, very important. And some funders actually want reports that go into quite a lot of detail at the end of the grant evaluation. So I think, organisations can get into difficulty as well if they can't account for those funds correctly.
Well, there's a follow-on element to that as well, and again, I'm sure that you all appreciate this, is that the carryover from one financial year to the next is actually quite tricky, and you've really got to have a very solid understanding of that carryover of funds and whether it's restricted or unrestricted. And if it is restricted, then there's a matrix. I often use this as a useful tool. There's a matrix of ways in which you've got to look at those, because those restricted funds, they come from grants across the top, and they're applied to activities in the vertical. And you have to have a mechanism at year end of being able to see what's left over at the grant level, and at the same time to assign that to the activity level, so that you've got that you can carry through as the next year progresses, to make sure that a restricted funding activity has got the required funds, and that the grant here is not overspent. And if it is overspent, you need a mechanism to top it up with unrestricted funds. And this is why I've said earlier on that doing this using typical packages, and I suspect this may be why the likes of Xero and Sage and QuickBooks have not yet produced software that's ideally suited to charities, because each charity is subtly different. And in Funder Plus, we've got a template to help charities out, which has this approach. But what we do is we extract the funds. In one case I'm working with at the moment, we extract the detail from Sage, and we then build an Excel model that can accommodate this inverted L that I've just described. But this carryover of funds from the prior year is really important.
Other questions for Laurie, or questions about Funder Plus?
How much does Funder Plus cost?
Funder Plus costs nothing.
Would you like to elaborate about how the service is connected with Community Foundation for Surrey, Laurie?
They're about
context of it.
Yeah, there are about 10 volunteers who work with charities. About 50% of everything that we do is accounting, and I'm the head of that accounting unit. And 2 years ago, I'm going to be quite frank here, 2 years ago, I knew nothing about charity accounting. But it was thanks to people like yourselves, and in particular Space to Grow in Farnham, who have been incredibly supportive to us, that we've learned an enormous amount about charity accounting. And that's why we've been so bold, if you like, to produce the guide to charity accounting, which of course we can make available to you. So in total about 20 volunteers, and we've got, I would say, of those probably at any one time 10 are reasonably active. I'm very, very busy. About 50% of my time is taken up these days helping charities with their accounts, and sometimes with other things. My wife and I, who is something of an HR specialist, and I ran a workshop in October last year for a charity, and that was a great success, I'm pleased to say.
Can I just ask if it's suitable for non-specialist use? So we're quite a small charity, currently cash accounting, but we're building up quite a large asset in a new build. So we've lucked it that we've managed to stay cash accounting, really, just a timing thing. But obviously, trustees move on and treasurers move on, and we need to be able to hand it over to somebody that may be less specialist. I just wondered how suited it was for that type of situation.
Well, again, this is one of the challenges of using the Sage, Xero, and QuickBooks, and this transition between those packages and actually having a solution that makes sense to people. And again, I'm going to use my Rubik's Cube here. And one of the things that we find, and you've got the green side facing you, is that I would say 90% of charities look upon this as just producing the accounts at the end of the year, and it's, for them it's a bit of a chore, and they quite often use an outside accountant to do this. But they're missing out on something, because the experience that we've gained in working with 10 charities over the last 2 years has been that by producing a set of management accounts, we've enabled them to look upon their charity in a very different way, and to gain insights into the financial foundations and the financial components of their charity in a different way. And that's been incredibly useful. But the problem, Gail, that you raise is very, very relevant. And that is, what happens if a key person in the charity who knows all about this stuff, and they move on, and then you've got to hand it over to somebody else. And the problem there is that to run Sage Xero, I've tried to adapt Xero for charity purposes, and I failed miserably. And I'm reasonably good at Excel. I would give myself a 7 out of 10 in Excel. And for me, it's much, much quicker to actually capture the transactions in some software. And we actually use, or we recommend, a package called ACE, and then to export those transactions into a bespoke Excel model. And to make sure that the Excel model is well understood, not just by one person in the charity, but by more than one person. And that means that if there has to be a handover, then it's relatively easy to do. And then the handover from one financial year to the next is also relatively easy to do.
Yes, I would totally back that up, Laurie. I mean, I saw an article yesterday. I might get this wrong. I think it was in Third Sector. It might have been an MPC think tank article. I don't know. I get a lot of articles I read. But it basically said that why is it that in the charity sector, so many trustees think they don't have to understand the numbers? And I have actually sat in meetings where people have said, oh, well, I'm not going to approve this because I don't really understand financial accounts, and I'm not really a numbers person. And you get a lot of comments like this. And the thing is, then when you also, so not all the trustees are necessarily engaged, and people seem to think that is the role of the treasurer, whereas in fact it's the role of the whole board. And secondly, as you have mentioned in your presentation, then when a new treasurer comes in, they will have, and I have experience of this, a different way of accounting the figures, which gives a totally different perspective to the board of trustees about the status, the financial status of the charity. So this is also why it has to be that the trustees have to fully engage in the figures, not just leave this up to the responsibility of one person. And the other point I would make on this is I do see a level of disengagement between the fundraisers, some of which I know will be on this call, and the trustees in terms of the finances. So there seems to be a sort of closed barrier between the discussion on the financial management and seeing fundraising as a separate function, whereas in fact the two have to obviously Venn diagram and align very closely together. And I don't see that as much as I'd like to see that in organizations. And I don't know what people feel in their organization if their fundraiser is involved in some of the discussions about the business plan, where the organization is going, what the organization wants to achieve, therefore what funding do they need to achieve for next year, therefore this is the funding you as the fundraiser need to help us to raise. I often see a disconnect between those kind of discussions. Right, any other questions? Because we need to wrap up in a minute.
Could I ask whether I can be seen? Is that it's Alec Derby speaking? Could you slightly left wing of the question, but with regard to the point protection of the brand, could you just elaborate on the various things? Obviously, there are obvious things such as domain names and so on, but actually protection of the brand. I was interested to how that is actually what boxes you think you should tick in that regard.
Alex, good question. And not very few charities think of themselves as a brand. And I'm going to answer your question by suggesting ways in which your brand could get really badly damaged. Again, I'm not going to mention who it was, but the chair lady of the trustees of a particular charity phoned me up, and there'd been an HR incident at their charity with an individual who they had been helping, and this individual had some mental challenges and was abusive towards a member of staff in the charity, and that became quite a tricky situation to manage, because the individual concerned who was abusive then reported back, and this individual had some mental challenges, reported back to his mother about the dialogue, and the mother was quite influential in the community, and therefore the brand was at risk. That's an example of the type of why you need to think about yourselves as a brand. And in particular, I touched on GDPR and I touched on safeguarding. And I know those of you, because I've worked with some of you who are working with children and doing a wonderful job. And I know that you are endeavoring to keep your records immaculate in this regard and to ensure that they are protected. But everything boils down to a human dimension here. And if somebody wanted to work at home on keeping some records up to date and took some records with them on the bus, on the train, and left those records behind, and these were GDPR specific records, then that would have to be reported to the regulators, and potentially that could damage the brand. So it's in that's on the one side. That's the sort of where the brand gets, where the charity's reputation. Let's think of it in that reputation context. The charity's reputation becomes at risk. And on the more positive side, the Space to Grow in Farnham has recently publicised a visit by the Duke of Edinburgh, and at the end of last year was one of the few charities in Surrey that received one of the Queen's Jubilee trees. And you can imagine, in the context of Space to Grow, getting because of the publicity associated with that, the benefit that had to the brand was very significant.
Yes, I just want to quickly just say to Alex as well before we wrap up. There's a number of ways in which you can protect the brand. One is obviously the intellectual property. That's the protection of your logo. It can be your colour, it can be your imagery, etc. And you would need to go to an intellectual property lawyer if you want to pursue that in a heavy way. I mean, for example, Cadbury's has the colour purple, their particular Pantone reference protected. Then there's this corporate social responsibility, which is such things as your environmental responsibility, your responsibility in all sort of sustainable development goals areas. And then there's the areas that Laurie has illustrated and touched upon, which is your public affairs and PR, and how that affects your brand by your activities. So there are a number of ways in which you can protect your brand. And I think people tend to think of it as in only one of those boxes, and not look at the whole 360-degree ways in which to protect your brand. And of course, the other one is your engagement with your employees. And we've just seen an example today, this week with the CBI, a director of the CBI engaging with employees that some thought was inappropriate. And of course, that then damages the brand reputation. So employee engagement also comes into brand reputation. So it's a very wide area of brand reputation, but very narrowly interpreted, unfortunately. If you want more help on that, Alex, do give me a call and we'll see what we can do to help you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to wrap up now because it is just 11 o'clock. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and just quickly share with you about the, I'm going to also stop the recording, okay?